Welcome to EMBARGOED, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade. I'm one of your hosts, Tim O'Toole, and with me today is Doug Jacobson, longtime co-host of the podcast, probably the record holder for most appearances on EMBARGOED. So welcome back to the podcast, Doug. Good to have you.
Okay, Tim, good to see you. We've had a lot of connection time over the last couple of days. Look forward to kind of doing a recap.
I do as well. I mean, so for those of you out there who are not in Washington and did not attend this year's BIS Update Conference, Doug and I have been hanging out at the Marriott Marquis the last 3 days, attending the Update Conference. BIS's big event of the year where they report on what happened in the past year, what they see as coming up. And from an export controls perspective, it's really an important event. So we thought we would provide an update from Update on the podcast. And so with
Absolutely.
that, Doug, I will throw it over to you to, just give some initial impressions of the conference and kind of what your takeaways were for the year.
Yeah. So first of all, one of the interesting things is that this was the 36th BIS update. It's actually the 37th year, but there have been a couple times where it's been canceled. And so this was the 36th actual conference. That includes some of the hybrid ones that have been done. This was the first fully in-person one since June of 2022 when the last one was held. And it was very well attended. So there were 1,200 people at the conference this year. And it was the first time where they had that many people at this venue, the Marriott Marquis, which is a good hotel. I like the way it's set up compared to the Washington Hilton, where it was for many years. It's much easier to navigate. But the problem is that the breakout rooms don't have the capacity to fit all of the people who wanted to go when there's 1,200 individuals. So they actually had a few of the very popular breakout sessions that there were overflow rooms. And I know, Tim, you said you actually like that, but some people who were coming all the way from Europe or wherever, they weren't so thrilled that they had to go sit in a room to
That's
watch the session on TV or see the slides on TV when the actual speakers were right around the corner.
Yeah, I'm sure that the impression was that they could have just stayed home and watched it on TV if they were going to do that. But I mean, first off, the crowds were amazing. I mean, I felt like I was like at a Taylor Swift concert or something. The big stars from BIS get up on the stage and they're playing to a packed house. But the breakout rooms were, too small. You pretty much had to get there 20 minutes in advance to even secure a seat. And so they did have some of these overflow rooms. I thought the overflow rooms were much less crowded. The feed was very clear. And the breakout rooms were set up in a way that you were going to be pretty far away unless you sat right up in the front. And so I thought it was actually easier to follow along.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the way the breakout rooms they were long and narrow. Yep. So the people at the back of the room were a long way from the speakers. So I agree. But overall, the venue is good. There were a lot of exhibitors as usual. And it's interesting talking about the update on Update. So I actually, I started this blog way before podcasts existed at the beginning of blogging. And I started blogging in 2003. On tradelawnews.com. And I actually used to live blog from the Update conference with Scott Garrity, who you know very well from the Export Compliance Training Institute. So Scott and I would actually blog, and we would sit in the sessions and we would talk about, for people who couldn't attend live, we would do a blog of the updates. So this is the next best thing.
This is the successor to the Update on Update blog. We're doing that podcast because it
Correct.
is the 2020s now. So we've kind of moved into the new tech era, just like BIS is moving in its website into a new era, right? So why don't you talk a little bit about the website?
Why don't we talk about kind of like our takeaways? Yeah. Let me just give you my impression. after I've been attending updates, I haven't been to all 36 or 37 of them. I first attended in the early 90s when it was at the Washington Hilton, when export controls were still a bit of a niche. There weren't as many people attending. It was not as popular it is now. But, it was always a good conference, and it's kind of just developed over the time. So I think that on what you take away from update depends on a couple of things. So first of all, I think it's really good um, for newbies or individuals who are companies who are outside of Washington who don't get to interact with the regulators very often. So that's really the best because they can meet the regulators and the like. Now, in terms of new information, I get different. I asked a lot of people what their thoughts were about update and what their takeaways were, and it really depends on how many times they've come here. So if it really was the first or second time, they're overwhelmed a little bit by the information, the people, and the like, but they always have a really good experience. Some of the more seasoned professionals, who've been coming for many, many years or who are more senior in their companies or in law firms, they always say, well, I didn't really hear too much that I didn't know or already. And that's always the challenge, trying to strike that balance between basic education and from when you're doing a training program, you're going to have some people who are very well versed in a topic and others who are hearing it for the first time. So really what you get out of it, even if you've been doing this for a long time, you can really get a lot out of it by talking to the exhibitors, networking with people, seeing people in the hall. And then ultimately, my view is the best part of Update is the roundtables. So we were that was this morning. And the first session I was there, 8:30 or so. It was packed. Now, this year's schedule was not the best because a lot of people were heading home. They wanted to get home for Easter. And so right before Easter was not the best time to have Update. But as we know, this was rescheduled from November because of the potential government shutdown back then. And so a lot of people were heading back. But early this morning, it was very, very well attended. Yeah. I have a picture of and it's not only BIS Update. So it's not only BIS people. So there were, they have a roundtable from OFAC. They had a roundtable from DDTC. And those were great because it's a way for other agencies to also interact, who are also, of course, in the export compliance space, not the EAR, but other related regulations. So the roundtables are very good because people can get answers to their questions, or if the speakers don't know their answers, they can at least connect a name and get an email, and then they can follow up. The other thing is not only the BIS staff, but also the export compliance officers from around the world all come in this week because they have meetings, but they're also there. So the export compliance officers from Hong Kong and Singapore and Europe and the other countries were all here as well. And they're at tables and people can connect with them if they're not traveling around the world. So it's like everybody in one room, and it's quite impressive. So that's always my favorite part of BIS Update is the roundtables.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think from my perspective, the sessions are usually fine, but a lot of them are pretty basic and they kind of walk through the regs. And if you're practicing for a while in this area, you kind of know what the regs say already. But I think that's helpful mostly by looking at kind of the topics that they select. You can see what their priorities are, what the hot issues are. No real surprises there. I mean, it was mostly focused on Russia, mostly focused on China, advanced computing, some of the changes to Part 744. So no real shocks in terms of the agenda, but still kind of reinforces the sense of like, these are the hot topics and there's nothing there that really surprised me. I think the ICTS presentation was kind of interesting to hear about the growth of that part of BIS. I think that the main thing that I take away from this conference is just kind of meeting the people who are both in this field, meeting the people at BIS and at the related agencies who are doing this work. And I think if one impression, and it's kind of both a substantive, but then just kind of a logistics impression, is I think that the other agencies really do coordinate with BIS, and all of the agencies are coordinating in a way that wouldn't have taken place 10 years ago. There just really is an interchange. I think you were talking about the picture of the OFAC table. OFAC's presence at BIS has only grown over the years over at the Update Conference, and OFAC and BIS, I think, are working
right
in a very coordinated way now that you wouldn't have talked about 10 years ago. And so I think that's the sort of thing that when
and also and the same is true for
for DDTC. Yeah,
and DDTC, of course, as well, with export control reform. So that's certainly something. So it was interesting. What are some of the things that they didn't talk about? Well, export control reform. That's kind of in the past. That was certainly the big topic for the last 10 years.
It's a blogger topic. It's the blogger topic.
And then another word that was rarely ever uttered during the entire conference was the word Iran. And
completely. That
has been overtaken by Russia and China.
Right. The only thing they talked about with Iran were really the drones that went from Iran to Russia, and that's because it was a Russia topic. I mean, it really was not.
So it's just interesting. Obviously, foreign policy, drives compliance and the issues, and things have changed dramatically in the last few years.
Yeah, it really has. And I think that is what you can get out of going to Update, even if you are, the substantive presentations are something that, might not be any, real news to you. And then, and I also think that they do try to make news at Update. I think we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the new initiatives that came out of Update, but I think, to the extent that they can bring in some new initiatives and announce them there, they try to do that. And it is good to hear from the leadership. I mean, I will say the other thing that strikes me about this Update, as you look at kind of the history of Update, and I haven't been to all 36 but I've been to a few. Is the tone from the top. I really do think that BIS has almost become the centerpiece of the Commerce Department, from the Commerce Secretary on down, in a way that it would not have been the main focus 10 years ago. It was export controls was kind of an obscure topic, I think, for most people, whereas nowadays, because it is kind of part and parcel of the sanctions against Russia, is probably the biggest foreign policy initiative of the current administration. BIS conferences kind of where the leadership goes to get their main message out from the Commerce Department.
No, absolutely. So first of all, just while we're thinking about it, for people who weren't there, follow along with us at the new website, we'll talk about that, which is bis.gov/update-conference. So bis.gov/update-conference. And what you'll find there is the agenda. And then you'll also find the presentations. Now, not all of the presentations are posted yet, but there are many of them already posted. And the ones that are not posted, we'll talk about in a minute, that relates to the semiconductors, both the semiconductor tools and also the advanced computing and supercomputers regs, because we'll talk about some news about that. So you can find the presentations. So they do make those available, even if you don't attend. One other thing that I, just in talking to people, what were their takeaways? One thing that I do has dramatically changed is the price. So it's $1,500 this year, which is, not that different than a lot of some of these for-profit organizations, but it's not cheap. And somebody did ask BIS, well, what about for smaller organizations or nonprofits, or could they possibly provide a separate other governments, for example, foreign governments, could they provide a reduced fee? And the BIS staff did say they looked at that, but it's just apparently not workable for a variety of reasons. But I think the price has doubled, certainly in the last few years. I think part of it is that the BIS doesn't subsidize it quite as much as they did in the past. And that really goes to one of my key takeaways that I got from the beginning, particularly from leadership, which is the main thing that Undersecretary Estevez and his speech, and Assistant Secretary Kendler and Assistant Secretary Axelrod, their speeches during the conference, those were all public, and they're now posted on the new BIS website. So you can find them there. But one of the things that I took away from Undersecretary Estevez's speech was the need for resources. And this is the problem with the current budget situation where, yes, they finally have a budget, but they're only increasing the amounts for the cost of living. And so, but the fact is that BIS is now front and center, not only for Russia, but also, of course, for China. And BIS is getting a lot of heat, from Congress in terms of the focus on the select committee on China, on the Chinese Communist Party, from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the like. And they need resources. And this is the problem: is that they expect BIS to do more, but they don't have they're not getting additional resources.
It is. I mean, it's a great point. And, when I mentioned that BIS is kind of front and center with OFAC on Russia, BIS is the whole game on China for the most part. I mean, BIS has been, while Russia has been a real mix of sanctions and export controls, and probably heavier on the sanction side, China, a lot of the trade rules, set aside the tariffs that are different, but a lot of the trade rules with respect to China are really focused on BIS and in the name of export controls, right? I mean, and so, it was a big part of the conference, but it is to the extent that the two big foreign policy issues and the two big, foreign policy adversaries or competitive countries, as I think they sometimes like to call them, it's Russia and China, and BIS is front and center in both of those, and yet their budget is kind of stagnated over the years. So it really is a resource issue that they are facing.
So if you look at Estevez's speech, his says, when adjusted for inflation, BIS's budget for core export compliance control, export control functions has remained essentially flat since 2010. So that's unbelievable.
Well, and in that period, right, that's when a lot of the China-related export controls have gone into place, almost the entire program. And at the same time, all of the Russia-related export controls have gone into place in that period of time. And go ahead.
And export control reform, where you have all these licenses that used to be over at DDTC are now over at BIS.
Yeah, I mean, so BIS's mandate has just grown exponentially, and their budget has remained essentially flat, which is a problem.
And so he says that this is not in the speech, but this is what he mentioned. The speech says, the public speech says, BIS's law enforcement component, Office of Export Enforcement, employs only 150 agents to monitor more than 30 million export transactions. And he said that's less than the number of agents that Homeland Security Investigations has in the city of Tampa, Florida. So there's more HSI agents in the Tampa field office than there are all of BIS's Office of Export Enforcement.
It is an issue that is going to keep coming up. I mean, I think that it makes sense that BIS's mandate has grown in this way, given the foreign policy issues that are in play. But if you're going to grow the mandate, you do actually at some point have to grow the budget, or you're going to run into issues. And I was impressed, despite that, at some of the initiatives that BIS is pushing forward in terms of, when we were talking about the ICTS panel, that group has grown from 5 people, I think 7 or 8 years ago, to 80, and I think the plan is to grow that office to 100 and some people. And ICTS may be the future in terms of what are at least from a technology standpoint, what is going to be the focus from the U.S. going forward. And still, that's kind of a China-related issue, but it is not, at least formally, a China-related issue. And I also think that what they're doing with the website, given the budget issues, is also impressive. It was about time that BIS moved over the website. And we were talking a little bit about this morning at some of the roundtables, and it was like the old website seemed to be kind of like this, circa AOL era internet type website where you couldn't even take stuff down. Like they just had a bunch of obsolete stuff on there because the only thing that you could do on the website was just kind of keep adding stuff to the website without ever being able to take it down. So they'd have these old PDFs that were outdated, and they'd have just the way to find stuff was really strange. And you would find it one time and you'd have to write down on your desk how you got there because it was so not intuitive that you wouldn't be able to get there again unless you remembered it. So it's great that they're updating the website. We got a little news about that this morning in terms of some of the things that they're doing. And also, I think you might have even taken down the email address, Doug. There are people at BIS who are interested in your views about the BIS website. So if you're an export control practitioner or somebody in compliance who uses the BIS website often, feel free to talk to BIS support, because the website, as I understand it, is still a work in progress, and they're trying to make it as user friendly as they can, and they're soliciting public feedback. So.
Yeah, so they have this. So, first of all, the new website, which was previously in beta format, is now bis.gov. It used to be bis.doc.gov. The old website is going to remain in place for a while until they finally transition everything. But the new website is bis.gov, so no DOC in there. They do have this initiative called BIS Connect. And this is what they're trying to do is they're trying to get like a user group, and they want input from users of the website to provide their guidance on that. But if you go to the old website, you'll see at the top now, it says we've moved, our new site is now live. Please go to bis.gov. So it's obviously based upon the newest technology. And it's in terms of the look and feel, it's obviously much better in terms of that. Now, one of the things that I have not been too happy about, and we were talking about that this morning, is that I was a big user, literally every day, of the old EAR PDF files. So those, you look at they had each of the PDF files, you clicked on each of the sections of the EAR or each of the categories of the Commerce Control List, and you've got a PDF file that pulled up that you could do searches on, and then you can download to have that version. You can email it to clients or whatever. Now they've moved to a all digital, they call it the interactive EAR. I don't think it's all that interactive. It's just active. But they call it interactive.
I think I heard you asking some questions about that.
So why is it called interactive? How is it interactive? It's basically you click on but they do have links to. So if I want to click on category 9, of the Commerce Control List, it says, okay, here's it. Now, one thing that I have noticed already, and this is a problem, it's very slow to load. So that's actually one. That's actually one thing that I think I don't know what's going on, but it is very slow to load, and it's digital. Oh, now I'm getting a page unresponsive error. So that's not good. Yeah. So this is why, again, uploading a PDF file or downloading a PDF file, whichever way you want to think about it. Oh, here. So it took like 10 seconds or 20 seconds to load. And that's not good.
BIS, if you're listening.
BIS if you're listening, but obviously it's a work in progress. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But the PDF files are so useful because then you can save them on your computer. Now, you can always go to ecfr.gov, which is another way to access the CFR or the Commerce Control List. But having, if I'm working with a client and I want to send the engineer, I don't want to have to send them the entire um, 60 pages of category 3, for example, I can just download the file, extract the relevant pages, and then email those.
No, and when we train at ECTI, we actually use the PDF for category 8 because
Right.
it's the smallest, and that's how we do the exercises. Is we actually use category 8. We have a bunch of ECCNs in category 8 that we're trying to get people to actually go in and classify, and so it was very helpful. Those PDFs were very helpful. I mean, I think we'll figure out. But look, I think at least my impression of the BIS Connect people and the people who are working on the website is they're very diligent, very eager to make this as good as possible. It's a great project, but like any project, there's gonna be some transition.
I'm looking at it now. I'm just doing some searches, and I just tried to save it category 9, which is not a long category, and I'm getting delays, and now I'm getting a not responding. So it's still, but anyway, I'm a big believer of the PDFs, and I hopefully those will stay on. So the website is one of the new developments, and they use this opportunity to roll that out and to provide people with new information. So other new developments. So there wasn't a lot of what I would say new information or updates other than what's happened in the past. And so I heard some criticism that, well, there wasn't a lot of here's what we're going to do. Now, that, there's only so much they can say. They're not going to say, hey, here are our new sanctions we're working on Russia until they're actually published. But the DDTC session did talk about what they are working on in terms of what they are rolling out in terms of some changes to the ITAR, for example. And but the big change is the big news, if this is really news, is that there's actually going to be now a new version 3.0 of the semiconductor rules. Yep. So these were, everybody refers to them as the October 7th rule, October 7th, 2022. And then
we did a podcast right after when that came out to talk about those rules.
So then they were updated a year later.
Hopefully they took some of our critiques. We had some critiques on there, and they
split them into two,
right?
Which was one of them. So the semiconductor equipment, and then the supercomputer rule. They segregated those. They reworked the ECCNs. What I heard, and I listened to part of these, but everybody came out of this. The uniform takeaway from the semiconductor equipment rule when they left the room is that they were more confused when they went in. So that's not positive. And that people do feel universally that they are overcomplicated. They are extremely long. It's when they revised them, it wasn't always easy to figure out what was revised, and it took BIS some time to issue FAQs, and then they had Taya Kendler did a short session on that online. And so the new semiconductor rule or rules, which will be making some further changes, will be issued on April 2nd. So we're recording this on the afternoon of March 29th, on Friday afternoon. And so the expected date that they will be sent to the Federal Register for public inspection is Tuesday, April 2nd. So everybody watch out for that if you're listening to this before that is published. And for those who are listening to this after April 2nd, 2024, you will have a chance to see what they're doing. They weren't being very clear or specific about what changes were going to be made. There are going to be some changes made to some of the de minimis rules. I did hear that. That's what was kind of a uniform. People were really confused about that. Yeah. And so we'll see what happens when that'll be the subject of another podcast.
It really is going to need to be, because one of the things that must have been a real challenge for the presenters was to present on essentially the current rules, knowing in your head what's going to happen on Tuesday, but not being able to talk about it. And so actually being clear about what the current rules were without spilling the beans on what the new rules were going to be. But part of the reason for the new rules was probably to fix some of the holes in the old rules, and you can't talk about that. So it was, I think after Tuesday, it'll be a lot easier to communicate about these rules and about what's new and what's been fixed, and maybe be more open about some of the flaws in the old rules because they fixed them now. But they couldn't do that at this conference. And I think that wasn't necessarily unfortunate, but I think that in a perfect world, the timing would have been that the new rules came out and then they talked about them, not they talk about the old rules and tell you that they're going to change in 3 days.
Right. Exactly. And so the other kind of new information, I think this was new information that was announced yesterday afternoon at the enforcement panel. And there were basically 4 main initiatives that Assistant Secretary Axelrod announced for the first time.
Yeah. So, and let's walk through what those are. I mean, the first one was some new freight forwarder guidance, which is always helpful. I know that I've worked with the freight forwarder rules and represented freight forwarders in the past, and actually figuring out what the potential liability was and kind of how they ought to structure their compliance program had been tricky. So I think that can be very helpful. And then they also came out with the new version of Don't Let This Happen to You. And I know for those of us who do enforcement actions like we do and represent companies and people in those actions, seeing what DOJ and BIS are up to and from the enforcement context is always very helpful. And I think they hadn't done a new one of those for a couple of years. So I'm guessing there's a lot of new Russian enforcement actions in the Don't Let This Happen to You.
Well, we all have clients in Don't Let This Happen to You, and it certainly is a good training tool.
Yes, exactly.
But now it's all online. It was very useful. They used to pass it out, print it and pass it out, and it was a nice little booklet to have. But it's now online, and so that's the second. Again, that's not major news or anything, but these were the 4 things that Secretary Axelrod focused on in terms of what the new developments are. But anyway, it hadn't been updated in a couple of years. I use Don't Let This Happen to You when I teach my law school class. I think it is useful for the summaries to see what the way that it's organized in terms of that's useful. So it certainly is more useful if it's more up to date.
Right. And I guess for those of you who are not kind of frequent practitioners in this area or in the enforcement realm, I mean, that is essentially the list, and it goes back pretty far, but the list of or summaries of enforcement actions in the export control space. It's both BIS and DOJ. And, it's kind of the whole range of enforcement actions ranging from, these weird actions against, single individuals to big enforcement actions against companies that could involve diversion of product all around the world. So it's also very helpful if I have an enforcement action and I kind of know what the facts are, you can search it electronically and find similar actions. So you can go in and talk to clients about kind of what the penalties have been and what potential penalties as a practical matter that they're facing.
Exactly. And also, but don't forget, it's also real life examples of export control violations and anti-boycott violations.
Anti-boycott. And we're going to get to that right now, because I think that's actually the biggest news from the conference, quite honestly. That this is, anti-boycott is its own little, very, very niche area in export controls practice. But this strikes me as a pretty big change in the sense that they're going to have a list now of foreign companies that have made boycott requests. And that really hasn't been the focus. And as a practical matter, since these rules only apply to U.S. persons, it still strikes me as one where this may be more of a kind of reputational shaming measure than an enforcement measure. But we'll see. I mean, OFAC actually has moved towards enforcement against non-U.S. persons, even though it's a U.S. person program. And so there might be these sorts of conspiracy or causing or some sort of theory that you can come up with that allows BIS to start going after non-U.S. companies that make these requests. We haven't really seen that, but this could be a first step.
So it's called the requester list, and you can find this at bis.gov/OAC, Office of Anti-Boycott Compliance. And if you scroll down, you'll see this new requester list, and there's a blue button. And it says this list is provided to assist U.S. persons to fulfill the reporting requirements of the anti-boycott regulations by raising awareness regarding certain sources of boycott-related requests. Each entity on this list has been reported by a U.S. person to BIS on a boycott request form as required by the EAR. And it says this list is not exhaustive, so that's important to remember, and will be updated quarterly. And it also says if you believe you've been listed in error and would like to discuss the listing, please contact the office. Now, from a compliance standpoint, it says U.S. persons are encouraged to diligently review transaction documents from all sources, but especially transaction documents with or involving these parties to identify possible boycott-related language and determine whether you have to report or not. So I don't consider this this is not going to be a list like the entity list or the denied persons list or the military end users list or the military end user control list or the SDN list or something. So it's not like a list that I would, want a client necessarily to screen upon. And it will be interesting to see whether some of those restricted party screening companies, create a list for their internal. I mean, it's certainly a good idea, like to screen. And obviously, if it was computerized and it was just a separate list, it'll be interesting to see. I don't think that this is not going to be one of those lists that's going to be kind of on the consolidated screening list that BIS publishes, because it's not a mandatory list and there's no violation per se by engaging in a transaction with a party on this list.
Right. I'll tell you how I will probably use this list is from time to time I'll get in anti-boycott questions, and you've got to figure out, okay, is this a request? Is this reportable? And it might help to actually, if you know who you're dealing with, who made the request or who made what might be a request in terms of to comply with an unsanctioned foreign boycott, it might be helpful to run the name of that party on the list and see, okay, is this somebody that Commerce is telling us has made these sorts of things before? Because some of these questions are so fact specific and so hard at the margins that if you're dealing with somebody that Commerce doesn't trust, you're probably going to err on the side of, this is probably a request. And if you know that this is somebody who's not on the list, you might not view that as a sign that it's not a request, but at least you're not dealing with somebody who is according to Commerce, a known boycott requester. So you better be very careful, because this is one that the Commerce Department is watching.
Yeah, the one thing that stands out to me is that there's a lot of parties from Malaysia. Malaysia kind of gets a little bit short shrift in terms of boycott because it's not a Treasury Department boycotting country.
Yep.
So, and Bangladesh, for example, but that's kind of that stands out to me, that there are many parties on here that aren't, for example, on what you would consider, on the Treasury Department's quarterly list of boycotting countries.
Yep.
So you have to remember that anti-boycott for BIS is not this. You can't just rely upon the quarterly list, which includes Saudi and Kuwait and some of those other countries that are known boycotters. But there are a couple of things that jump out at me. There actually are some subsidiaries of some U.S. companies on here, which is interesting. There are freight forwarders on here. There are many companies in Malaysia on here. Probably there are some subsidiaries of some major international European-based companies on here. So there are some household names on here that will be interesting if I had a client whose subsidiary is on here, I would start taking a hard look at that immediately.
100%. I mean, those clients are in the zone of danger because they are U.S. persons, or at least as defined under the
controlled group.
Right, controlled group as defined under the anti-boycott laws. And so they actually making a request could get them in trouble directly. And so they ought to, if I had a client with U.S. connected companies on that list, I would be trying to figure out what's going on and how we might want to see if we can get removed from that list.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And then I think the last big initiative related to, the ongoing issue of diversion, which has been a huge priority for Commerce, has been a huge priority for OFAC and for DOJ, and a particular type of diversion where U.S. origin items subject to the EAR, are found on the battlefield in Ukraine after there's a deconstruction of military products that are found on the battlefield. And so why don't you talk about that? There was an announcement with respect to those sorts of products. It sounds like there's going to be a new instantaneous information, but I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work.
Yeah. So this initiative is talking about, well, this is announced again as the one of the initiatives, Assistant Secretary Axelrod, and he said that we heard directly from NGOs, trade associations, semiconductor companies that they wanted more information on Russian front companies to assist them in their compliance. So now that they're going to, they've gone further than these red flag letters, and now they're actually sending information from this that they've obtained directly to U.S. manufacturers and distributors. And these data sets list the parties in these countries. And they said they've now sent more than 20 letters to various U.S. companies, each containing a list of more than 600 foreign parties identified in the data sets. And in those letters, we've requested that American companies voluntarily stop shipping to these parties due to the high risk of transshipment. So this is going to be, I think, a part of the, as they get more information, more parties. So this is just another list that's not public. This is a double secret probation kind of list.
It's called the unofficial list.
The unofficial list. But here's one thing with that. I just dealt with this issue for a European company who was applying for a license in a European country, and the European country said, "We will issue your license to," there was like 10 end users, "except for we will not authorize you to ship to one of the customers that was on this list that they applied for as an end user on their license application." And then what happened was the European government, when asked what the basis for this was, they sent them a printout. I won't name the name of the tool, but it was a well-known one of these companies that aggregates information and then tries to connect the dots and then puts red flags on certain parties that they may be connected to an SDN, for example. So then my client came to me and I started looking at the data, and in our firm, we subscribed to this database that this European company was using. And I'm like, if you start drilling down, the data that they were relying upon that allegedly made this connection to Russia was actually a transaction that had occurred prior to February of 2022, and it was one sale. So that is not really should not be enough to say that's a red flag for doing business with this company in China or wherever, that they may have had one transaction with Russia in 2020 or 2021.
Right.
And so this is the problem with open source data.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that quite often, where I think the open source data and some of these services try to amalgamate this data are trying to be over inclusive. It's much better if you don't miss anything, right?
Correct.
And so there will be a connection that when you look at it is not a particularly helpful connection in determining whether or not there's a sanctions issue going on, or I've seen this in the UFLPA as well,
Right.
whether there's a supply issue going on, because the connection quite often is nothing, but it's listed because if you don't list it and it turns out to be something wrong, then you don't want to have your database say that they missed it. And so I think that a lot of these databases are almost by definition over-inclusive because they're listing anything that could potentially be anything. And a lot of this stuff, when you look at it closely, is doesn't help you determine whether or not you've got an issue.
Yeah, so I think that companies who receive these letters, obviously it's useful information, but I think companies need to make their own independent judgments. They obviously need to talk to the companies who are involved, if that's a good customer, for example, and also that then goes to the next point of course of having the appropriate end user certifications, appropriate language in terms and conditions. And again, it's ultimately about know your customer, and then making sure that your customer has also their sufficient control so that your customer is knowing their customer, and that you're and that's really what it's all about. So again, all these sources of information are useful, but it doesn't mean that it is prohibited per se, and companies need to make independent determinations.
Right. And it's, and by definition, it's kind of less than the entity list, right? It's less than the unverified list because they've got these lists that are available. And if they had real hard data, those companies would go on one of those lists, presumably. This is kind of, they've got less, but they've got enough to essentially say, well, here, take a careful look at this company. But it's not a no, and it's not even a go get a verification letter. All right. Anything else? Any other impressions from Update 2024, or is this update in the books?
I mean, overall, again, I give credit to BIS staff because it's a lot of work putting these together. I do, again, the general consensus from people I talk to is they always get something out of it. And the people, particularly, I have a lot of friends and clients and fellow lawyers, as you know, from Europe who come over, and it's a great opportunity for them to meet people and to meet the regulators and to meet and see what's going on here. Now, again, this is one of those things where BIS has, a lot of the European countries now are emulating this. So BAFA in Germany does now a big export control event. They just had a big one in Italy, in February. So BIS was the model, and so now that both governments and the private sector continue to put these on, and BIS does a good job of sending people out around the world to talk to governments and to other individuals and do training and the like. So the more you have an opportunity to interact, the more you have an opportunity to go to these conferences. I think that's what this is all about.
Yeah, I was really impressed with BIS staff. I thought the people who did the little badges were actually very helpful. The QR codes, there's QR codes everywhere, and that was very efficient. And I thought the use of the tech was good. I thought the app that they used for the event was very good. I've still got all my presentations on there and have the agenda, and so it was very helpful to follow along on the app and not have to carry around a bunch of pieces of paper with me. So I thought all in all it was a successful event, especially since it was rescheduled once already, and that they had these issues with respect to the timing of particular regs probably weren't didn't come out exactly when they wanted them to. But I thought all in all, very well done by BIS. The 36 was,
and there'll be a 37th. I know that they're already working on it for next year, and so we'll have a chance to do a debrief on that one as well. All
right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you for coming on, Doug. And everyone out there, thank you for listening, and stay sanctions free.
There you go. And export compliance. Stay export compliance.
Compliant.
Exactly.
Exactly.
All right, great.
All right. Thanks a lot, Doug.
Produced by Heartcast Media.